Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 2. We're going to be talking a little bit about the environment today and why that in fact matters. So we're talking about why the environment matters. Well, as you see here, the environment provides some resources, right, that the company essentially needs to complete whatever it is that the customers want. The environment can be a good thing, can be a bad thing depending on what vantage point you have. It can have opportunities and threats. Those are things that are very external. Right, strengths and weaknesses would be considered internal. It also is going to shape the various decisions that executives are going to make. Right, so if you wonder why a CEO decides to, for example, reduce the workforce, it's because the environment indicated that the right decision to do would be to reduce the workforce. Right, so it's the environment that's usually determining what executives are doing. So we need to do an external analysis in order to understand the environment. Well, why? Because it helps you to see whatever threats and opportunities are available. This is the big one, right? You can actually figure out if you can get an above normal profit. And the idea is that you only want to enter industries where you can actually get that above normal profit. If the external analysis tells you that the profit would be subpar, you just would not enter that industry. So that's why you want to do an external analysis. But you can also better understand how competition is going to work in an industry, helps you see what the players are. You can maybe see some holes that could be filled in the marketplace. And that would be one of many informed strategic choices that you could actually make by doing the external analysis. So external analysis is truly very important to do as a company. One of the most popular tools to use to complete the external analysis is the 5-force analysis. Now you might have heard of this. It is Michael Porter, that comes up with this. And the interesting thing, right, is in management, a lot of the theories tend to be very, very new. Right? So you look at, say, some of your sciences, and the theories have been around for just eons, right? It seems like. In management, everything is pretty new. This guy, Michael Porter, who is actually still a practicing professor, came up with this idea of a 5-force analysis to understand behavior. His question is, why do companies outperform other companies? That was his fundamental question. And he used 5 forces analysis to help explain why that might be the case. So it's a technique to understand how competition works in an industry, why certain companies might have an advantage that other companies actually do not. Right, so that's why we talk about this. It helps you see some potential new entrants, helps you see substitutes, helps you understand whatever suppliers there might be, whatever buyers there might be, and it also helps you understand the intensity of rivalry, which refers to competitors in an industry. Right? So the key is the 5-force analysis is going to say, should you enter, should you not enter? And the trick to know, these are the forces. We'll actually show you this in visual right over here. This is the forces right here. You see this is the 5th one, competitive rivalry. All the other forces together determine how much rivalry there's going to be in the competition. But the idea is that the greater these forces are, the lower profit is going to be. So let me talk about that for a second. So let's say that there is a greater threat of new entrants. That means that it's more likely for there to be new entrants in an industry. Well, think about that. It means more competition. What does that do to your profits? Right? It reduces them. Think about buyers. Right? Well, if buyers tend to have more power over companies in your industry, and that's going to mean that you're going to have to do what they tell you to do. We'll talk about some of the competitive implications in just a moment. Similarly, it works for substitutes. If the threat of a good substitute product is higher, that puts a ceiling on how much you can charge for your products in your industry. Also, suppliers has an effect, as well as rivalry. Any of these things become greater threats, that's going to reduce how much profitability your industry could actually have. And that would then tell you the rational decision is to not enter that industry. So let's talk about all of these. Let's start by talking about the threat of entry. Right? And here it says threat of potential entry into an industry. Right? So what this is telling you is how likely are you to see lots and lots of competitors, right? The stronger this threat is, the more likely you are to have competitors. And you don't want to have more competitors, is from the perspective of a company. Customers, on the other hand, want more companies, right? The more companies there are, the more competition, the lower prices end up being for products. So the thought process is that if companies can enter an industry very quickly, then any above normal profits are going to go away. Because think about this, right? What's going to happen is some company is going to offer whatever product you are charging, let's say $5 for, and let's say your true cost is something like $3. So you make a above normal profit of $2. Well, another company is going to come in eventually and offer it for $4. We're bringing profit down to $1. And eventually a company is going to come in and say, we're okay getting almost nothing. We're going to charge about $3.02, right? And maybe 2 cents profit. And that makes it not feasible to compete in an industry. That's what the Uber app has done to taxi industry, right? It has disrupted the entire industry. And you think about it from Capsim too, right? If you're in the low end, right, the lower you drop your price, that's going to drive demand to that price point. So if you are in the low end, and let's say it tells you that in theory, $22 is an acceptable price to charge within the range, but you've got your competitors charging 18, well, that's meaning that 18 is actually the better price that you have to charge in order to have customers buy your product, right? So that's a little bit about entry. You would rather be a closed marketplace and not have any new competition coming in. Think about that from Capsim. Capsim is a closed market, right? You can't have other companies enter the industry, which in theory should give you an advantage, but it doesn't always do that, as you guys probably know from the first round. Okay, so the impact of the threat of entry of new firms into the market on increasing competitive pressures is going to depend on how many candidates want to enter the industry and how resourceful are they? Are they coming in with nothing? Are they coming in with lots of finances and good ideas and whatnot? Also, is the entry candidate going to face a higher or lower entry barrier? Let's talk about what an entry barrier actually is. An entry barrier is going to determine if it's easy or if it's not easy to enter the industry. So in turn, it determines how strong that threat of entry is going to be. Right? So the higher the entry barriers are going to be, the harder it is for a company to enter. So higher entry barriers, lower threat of entry. Lower barrier entries, higher threat of entry. Right? So it works inverse to that. And we'll talk about some examples of entry barriers. Think about Keurig, right? Which is a single-serve coffee maker. Well, if you want to purchase the competing coffee maker, like let's say another single-serve product, you would have to buy a completely new machine, right? And that works the same way if you're talking Xbox and PS4 as well. You have to buy a whole different console, right? Well, that ends up being an entry barrier because you have to buy a whole new system in order to get into whatever new product it is that we're talking about. So that's going to be entry barrier. It's also going to depend on how attractive the growth and profit potential is going to be in the industry too. It also is a big issue. This is actually going to be a fuller list. It's going to go beyond that example that we just did. These are the common entry barriers, right? So if any of these are present in the environment, that's going to suggest that the threat of entry is actually going to be low, right? So let's talk about what these things mean. Let's start with economies of scale, right? So economies of scale is going to cover cases where a company is able to produce very much and spread out its fixed costs over quite a large volume of production. That's going to imply that if you're entering, you need to be able to produce very much at a lot of products. And if you can't produce that, your costs will actually be high because you would have a cost disadvantage. So that's economies of scale. Product differentiation is going to cover the example that we just spoke about a little earlier, which was the example of Keurig, right? So with this one, if you want to switch to a competitor's product, then you have to incur as a customer a switching cost, right? And those switching costs make it prohibitive to enter whatever new industry that would, or excuse me, whatever new product that would actually be. Cost advantages independent of scale just refers to anything else that doesn't fit in one of the categories. So usually it's intangible things such as some type of a knowledge advantage they might have. So McDonald's, for example, has a certain way of salting the fries. It's more efficient, right? And the secret is it's a triple arch. They go like that. So if you are salting fries with a big vat of fries, what you do is you take a salt shaker, you go like that, make an arch. Yeah, and I guess I'm realizing you can't see it. It's the other way. So you would go like this, and then that, a triple arch. Right? And that's, they find, is a very efficient way of salting the fries. It's a lot easier than shaking a salt shaker, right, all over the fries. So that's something that gives them an advantage in bringing food to the customer quicker. Right, so that's just one of the advantages. That's just independent scale. It's nothing to do with how large the company is. Right, so you can talk about smaller shops that are around the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, like Emporium Pies. Right, they have a certain secret that allows them to serve as many customers as they have. You ever line up there in one of their shops in Bishop Arch, for example, and see how long that line can get? Right, well, they have a very efficient way of getting customers through. So those are cost advantages that are independent of scale. And the last one refers to any type of a government subsidy. So it could be like a handout that you might see. The auto industry had that happen several years ago. There were a lot of the big auto companies actually had money, bailout money, call it that came from the government. So that's one example of that. Let's move on past this threat of new entry and move into the bargaining power of buyers. Right, so buyers are referring to customers of your company's product, right? And so buyers can ultimately bring the profit potential down quite a bit, right? So they can squeeze profits, they can demand lower prices, or it's not just about pricing, right? They can also demand more service from your firm, right? So think about where that might be the case, right? So customers saying, look, we are not going to tolerate bad customer service, and if you don't give it to us, then we're going to go elsewhere, right? So if you look at the recent headlines, if you guys ever in the airline industry, right? For example, a lot of the airlines are now bringing back snacks, right? So Delta is now giving you pretzels. American Airlines just said they're going to start doing that as well. You compare that to Spirit or Frontier, where everything is extra, right? There is nothing provided to you. You don't have free drink or anything, right? So customers have said that if we're going to pay higher prices in Spirit or Frontier, we expect to get free things. Right? Southwest is very popular with its policy of not charging for bags, right? To check a bag on the airline. That's what customers expect there. If they were to drop that, customers would then say, well, you know what? I'm not going to pay a premium to fly Southwest anymore versus going with Spirit or Frontier. So that's one way that customers could basically drive down whatever profit potential there might be in a particular industry. Okay, so these are some things that will encourage buyers to have more power over the firms that are in an industry. So if you see any of these things that are present, right, then you know that threat of buyers or bargaining power of buyers tends to be high. One is going to be that there's only a few number of buyers that are actually purchasing whatever product it is that your industry is selling. That's going to be one of them. And if that's the case, they obviously have more demand. So if you think about the roller coaster industry, so what happens is once a year, Six Flags says these are our new rides that we're building at all of our parks worldwide. And what will happen is the roller coaster manufacturers that they purchase the rides from, they might only have 4 or 5 projects they're doing every year. So they are very dependent on Six Flags knocking on the door saying that we want to purchase a roller coaster from you, right? So it tends to be that Six Flags has lots and lots of power over roller coaster manufacturers, and they can demand better quality, they can demand better pricing, whatnot, and also they'll do bundling, stuff like that. So small numbers of buyers. Some or many buyers have sufficient bargaining leverage to get some type of a price discount or something else that favors them. Right? But a lot of buyers tend to be price sensitive, and they can set limits on price increases, right? That will happen, right? So you think about one example of that being Uber. They know that there is a limit to how much they can charge for surge pricing before customers say, I'm just not taking the Uber, right? I'm going to call a cab or I'm going to take Lyft, right? So there's some limit to how much price increase the customer is willing to tolerate. The other one is if the industry is undifferentiated, if it is very similar to other products, like one company's product is very similar to the other company's products, so like cotton swabs would be an example of that, then buyers tend to have more power. Another would be if the buyer could just get into your industry and do whatever it is that you're doing themselves. So housekeeping is an example of that. It's something that everybody can do, but we sometimes have busy schedules. We hire somebody to do that, but if they come back and say, look, I'm going to charge you twice as much money as you've been paying me before, the customer is probably going to say, well, I'm just going to clean myself. Right? I don't actually need you, or use a family member to clean. Right? So they have some options. They're not going to take whatever it is if the price increase is too high. Now let's talk about substitute products. We talk about buyers, let's talk about a substitute first. We need to talk about what a substitute product actually is. Right? A substitute product is something that comes from a different industry that serves a very similar purpose to the products or services offered in your industry. All right, so think, for example, the beer industry. At some point, if beer is too expensive, customers will say, well, look, a substitute for beer would be something such as liquor, right? And they'll switch over to that, or wine possibly, right? So if beer prices get too high, customers might say, look, I'm just going to drink wine from now on and not beer. So substitute matters when customers are attracted to the products of companies that are in other industries. Tends to be that if you drink beer, you also tend to like wine, right? Doesn't always work the other way around, but that tends to be the case. So if the price of something goes up too high, they're just going to switch to whatever that substitute product would be. Okay, so that's one issue. There's obviously a difference between that and rivalry, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Substitutes are going to create a limit to how much prices can increase, beyond which they would switch to the substitute product. Substitutes always come from outside the industry, so this is another reason why you have to use an external type of analysis to see what is actually going on in other industries. Now let's talk a little bit about suppliers. Suppliers are the ones that you are purchasing from. So powerful suppliers can squeeze profits in your industry by increasing their prices, or they can decrease quality, leaving you with an inferior product. So these are some things that might give buyers more power. If you notice this list, it is the opposite of whatever conditions facilitated supplier power. So it's a small number of companies that are in the supplier's industry. If the product is very differentiated, let's say that your product in your industry is very different from other companies, that's going to give them more power, right? Because there's more stuff they would have to do. They can't just standardize whatever output they're making. Lack of close substitutes for the supplier's products. That means that you could not switch to another company in a different industry to do a very similar thing. That would give them more power. And also, if the supplier could just produce or do whatever your function in the supply chain is on their own, right? They could just take your spot, right, and make the product. That's going to give them a little bit more power. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about competitive rivalry. Right, so rivalry is going to refer to how much competition there might be in an industry. Right, so what can happen is, competitors going to get a strategy and make a move that's like a decision that's going to give you good results. Well, what happens is rivals have little choice but to offer their own counter. Right, so what's going to happen is, think about like the dollar menu. Right? When the dollar menu was very popular, one company would introduce it, and then another, say McDonald's introduced it, then Burger King followed suit. McDonald's would then add, something new to it, mozzarella sticks, and Burger King says, oh, well, we have to get mozzarella sticks, and then it just continued. Right? So what you're seeing there is a pattern of action and reaction. So it just continues to play out further and further. And a lot of times what will happen, especially with pricing, they'll eventually drop to a point where it's so low that really no company is making any profit. And that's what you will likely see in the low-end industry in CapSim. Right, so I'm not going to read everything that's on this slide. I do encourage you all to read everything that's in here too. But let's just go ahead and move on. That's rivalry. Now for some limitations of the five-force analysis, right? So these are some things you have to be aware of with the five-force analysis. It is going to assume that competition is a zero-sum game. What does that mean? That means that if one company is doing really well, another company is doing very poorly. That's zero-sum. If you have a case where one company can do really well and other companies can do also really well, then there's something suspicious going on. You don't really have a case where five forces analysis is appropriate. Another thing is that it doesn't really consider the possibility that companies are going to form alliances and cooperate with other companies. So what happens if there's a case where companies work together on, say, a joint venture, like happens between Miller and Coors, or they worked together, shared a lot of their marketing data with each other, and they were trying to use that to take down the big company, Anheuser-Busch, which has, of course, merged with InBev. Right? So that was one case where the five forces would say, I don't really know what to do with that, right? Because collaboration is not something it outright considers. All right, so these are some limitations of the five forces analysis. This is some ways of identifying whatever driving forces could be there in an industry. Right, so here's another list. You can go ahead and read this on your own. But these are some typical developments that can ultimately affect the forces and can either raise or could lower the forces. Right? So these are all things that go through. Now think about industries that have gone through changes such as this, such as telecommunications. You've seen some huge shakeup in the types of companies that are actually competing there. Right? So again, these are the lists of things that are going to affect whatever forces there might be in an environment. All right, and here are some more stuff to consider with change. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next slide. Okay, so these are some things to think about as you try to determine how much impact there's going to be of these driving forces. First, you want to say, are the driving forces collectively acting to cause demand to be changed? Right? Are they causing demand to go up, or are they causing demand to go down? Right? Well, if they're causing demand to go up, then the impact of the driving forces, right, should be that there's more profitability. Right? So the threats actually should be dropping. Okay, is the collective impact of these forces making competition more or less intense? Right, we talked about that. When you have more competition, that tends to drive pricing down. That tends to result in lower industry profitability. And then you can say, well, the combined impacts of the forces lead to higher or lower industry profitability, right? So all these three things interact to determine how much profitability there might possibly be as a result of these changes. So let's talk about how you might go about adjusting the strategy to prepare for these impacts caused by the driving forces. I will draw some conclusions about what strategy adjustments will be needed. Okay, so here's some things to think about. Okay, what we're going to do on these next few slides is we're going to talk about some of the industry structures, and then what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what the key opportunities will actually be, all right, if you're in that type of an industry. All right, so this has an effect, obviously, on the forces that would be present in that industry. The first one is the introductory industry structure. This one is a brand new industry, right? It's something that has not had companies competing in before. So the self-driving industry, self-driving car industry, that's an introductory type of structure, right? So new industry is based on breakthrough technology, and you don't have a standard, right? So you guys remember when there was Blu-ray and there was also HD DVD? We're going to talk about that here. There was a case where there was not a product standard. Some movie makers were making HD DVDs, some were making Blu-rays. They were not compatible. So you'd have to go with one system over the other. I chose incorrectly. I chose HD DVD, and HD DVD was not the one that was successful at the end of the day. No dominant company has emerged yet, right? So you don't have a Google of the industry quite yet, and new customers are coming from never having purchased products in your industry before. Best opportunity in this case is going to be having a first mover advantage. By having a first mover advantage, you can get the leadership in the technology that can help to determine whatever product standard will emerge. You can make it so that supplies will cost quite a bit. You can buy up more than you actually need in the supply. That's called locking up assets. And you can also create switching costs, which would mean that if a customer wanted to switch to the competitor's product, they'd have to incur substantial charges. The next one is considered growth. So think about it from your customer standpoint. Growth, customers are saying that, you know what, the product has already been introduced, and now I'm going to start buying into it because there's already been some customers that have went through the trial and error of that. So in this kind of an industry, demand is growing very fast. You still don't have a dominant company yet. There's going to be very high R&D costs that are going to need to be incurred. That you don't quite have an economy of scale yet, and also you're starting to see a lot of growth internationally. Best thing you can do in this kind of an industry is to do consolidation. You can acquire other companies, get into franchising, and also if you can try to figure out some type of an economy of scale, right? So make it so that you actually can spread those fixed costs out over a greater amount of production. The next one is mature, and this one right, and advertising might be necessary because of the fact that you can't expect customers just to go look for you, right? They need to be convinced to purchase your product. So this is something that's currently going on, right, with cable that's not fiber cable, or internet that's not fiber. Right, so that the companies need to actually go out and say, "Hey, look, we're Time Warner, we're Charter Cable, you should come out and go with us because we can bring your product for far cheaper than you're gonna see with fiber internet." Industry-wide profits have started to decline. You're also not seeing as much innovation. The best thing that you can do is take your current products and refine them. You can also offer some more value by improving service, or you can use alliances to help bring down some of your costs. The last one is where not only is there no growth, you're actually seeing sales decline. And this is a declining industry structure. In this one, a lot of the established companies have exited. Companies aren't really investing in maintenance anymore, so this is where the landline telephone companies would want to be. The only reason why they maintain the telephone wires is because the government says that they have to, but they don't want to invest in maintenance anymore of those wires. Best thing in this kind of an industry is going to be market leadership, a niche strategy. They could harvest whatever they're doing. What that basically means is you use certain assets of your company, right? You make something out of it. You're basically going to eventually deplete whatever resources you have. You're not going to purchase maybe replacement stuff, right? And then the last opportunity is to eventually divest, just getting out of the industry altogether. That would be the divest option. Okay, everyone, thank you all very much for watching my lecture today, and I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of the day.